Welcome to the second half of Oceans, the Circulation of Knowledge about Regional and or Global Spaces. So we have two presentations in this second session, and we will begin with Viktor Carl-Magnus Andersson from the University of Oslo, and he'll be speaking on deep sea transposition of deep sea knowledge on the move in post-war Scandinavia.
Thank you. So in this presentation, I want to illustrate some ways in which the deep seas became conceptualized as regions of life and nature during the 1950s. I'll present some examples of how this production of knowledge, these attempts of writing forth and visualizing the most extreme depths, moved in and was conditioned by cultural contexts in which regional and more national scales were presented. Lastly, I will try to open for a discussion or a common thought process on what these particular movements of deep sea knowledge implied at that time, and how we can assess such knowledge in our contemporary charged landscape, where the fate of the deep seas and the oceans overall is very much a political topic. A few words on the two expeditions that I've studied. The Swedish Albatross expedition between 1947 and 48 had as its main research object the geological features of the deep sea floor. As the Swedish historian Erich has shown, the deep sea cores retrieved during the Albatross expedition played a crucial role in shaping notions of deep time and history of the planetary climate in the 1950s and beyond. However, deep sea fauna was also trawled from record depths of over 7,000 meters. The Danish Galatea expedition had investigations of the deep sea flora and fauna as their primary focus from the outset. Under the leadership of zoologist Anton Buhr, trawls were made frequently at depths and in trenches between 4,000 and 10,000 meters depth. As historian, sorry, there's some kind of timer. As historian of science, Erich has noted the two deep sea expeditions was part of a revival of sorts of deep sea biology during the mid-20th century. The new findings stimulated attempts to make better sense of the life forms that had been found, but also to make better sense of the distinct regions of depth, of how to understand the sea as both a singular and plural. However, it's important to emphasize that the expedition members' relation to the area of inquiry was indirect. The sparsity of empirical material and practical limitations of trawling, mainly the fact that the trawl damaged many of the retrieved organisms, raised issues of how to produce credible knowledge of the deep as a differentiated ecological play. The first thing to know about the work of these expedition members is that it mobilized different ways of understanding and ordering the deep seas. In the marine scientists' writing, ways of seeing nature were actualized. These ways of seeing dictated what was sought after, emphasized what was relevant or fascinating, and what was not. This is made very clear when one studies in two major books that resulted from the expeditions: the Gothenburg oceanographer Hans Pettersson's book Med Albatross Havskytten from 1950, and Galatea's Nordomseiling, which was jointly written by the Galatea expedition members and was published in 1953. One chapter of special interest in the latter book is the zoologist Anton Buhr's chapter Animal Life of the Deep Sea. For the sake of time here, I will only mention the two accounts very briefly. Hans Pettersson wrote of the totality of the ocean as a web of life. Still getting these keys. Pettersson wrote of the totality of the ocean as a web of life, focusing on the uniformity and the biogeochemical processes and systems of the sea. Now, because the purpose of the expedition was largely to obtain knowledge about the sediments of the ocean floor, Pettersson did emphasize the connection between organic life of the surface waters and the geological features of the seabed. The sea was for Pettersson fruitful and bountiful, but it was perceived as such mainly by way of hydrological, geological, and chemical features that could indicate and say something of the ocean as a large-scale entity. In his chapter, Animal Life of the Deep Sea, the marine zoologist Anton Buhr asserted rather instead several intelligible divisions in the deep sea, exemplified, for example, by this quote. To try to get a sense of the animal life out there, the best place to start is at depths of 4,000 to 5,000 meters. This is due to the absence of a clear dividing border between the animal life of the continental slope and that of the deep sea. As a contrast, there is such a degree of change as one passes a depth of 4,000 meters that it is clearly discernible from the contents of the trough. If we continue even deeper to about 6,000 meters, no abrupt shifts are noticeable. However, the special fauna found by Galatea in the deep trenches thus motivate a description of its own. Brun's writing to deep sea did mobilize ideas of a total and dynamic ocean systems in the same similar way as Pettersson did. But it is crucial to note that the dynamic between the organic and inorganic aspects of the sea was stationed in a rather different manner in Brun's text. Brun directed his reader's attention towards the particularity of living beings, to animals and creatures, and crucially, the ways in which these jointly constituted and affected ecological zones. Now, these accounts were largely a result of Pettersson's and Brun's respective training and belief in their scientific disciplines and the history of those disciplines. However, those contingencies themselves are very interesting, but I will skip them for now as they're not the main focus on this talk. Rather, I would like here to make the point that these different conceptualizations of the deep ocean must be analyzed in relation to their communicative form, meaning the very particular format of the two books, which read as hybrids between scientific report, popular science, and travel. The form in turn must be thought of as a product or as something that responds to the aforementioned difficulty of knowing things for certain of the deep sea. The sparsity and often compromised state of the specimens caught in the trawling nets made ground for hypothesis making, for inferences about the relation between organisms and their milieus, and therefore made the space for where the speculative or entertaining held some sway. So the deep seas were looking for. They were formulated within appeals towards a reading audience, appeals to which the writers could work with effects such as curiosity, wonder, or marvel. They therefore contained elements of adventure, exoticist, and sometimes even racist description of the inhabitants of tropical islands, as well as a multitude of photographs and illustrations. As I will now show, these attempts at envisioning and understanding the deep seas found other articulations in Scandinavia and beyond throughout the 1950s. As we now further trace the afterlives of these two expeditions, it is important to note that they were largely public or popular ventures even as they unfolded. As historian Christian Nielsen has shown, this was especially true for the Galatea expedition, which even deployed a press section on board. For members of both expeditions, there was then at least partially established audience and established channels into a public space of news, thought, and opinion. This is also shown in the Scandinavian reception of the books Med Albatross över havsdjupen och Galateas civilization. Through this reception, the ocean sciences intersected into an intellectual and literary milieu. For example, the known Swedish poet Östen Sjöstrand reviewed Hans Pettersson's book in both Danish and Swedish newspapers, praising Pettersson's rendering of the adventures of oceanography. Astronomy has a firm grip on the creative mind in the fields of art, poetry, and music. It may have found a competitor of equal strength in the shape of oceanography. In the oceanic world, our standard calculus of time vanishes in the same surreal way as it does among the stars. A review in the Swedish newspaper Svenska Dagbladet noted similarly these stimulating, as they called it, renderings of oceanography, and also commented on the interesting biological findings of this species. The reviews in Danish press of Galatea setting were mainly favorable. In the Danish paper Berlinske Tidende, it was noted how the reviewer noted the importance of making such knowledge a question for the men. Quote, the Danish people have an unusually strong interest in everything pertaining to the ocean. The mysterious, strange, and bountiful life in the depth beneath the surface draws attention and stirs the imagination. The book gives people a taste for these things, an interest, and it would therefore be proper if at the end of the scientific work all the results were shared in another book so that the full tale may reach beyond the obscure journals of science. It should be noted also that the oceanographic and marine zoological themes of the two books that caused such a stir coincided with the great general interest in the oceanic that had been spurred first by the Norwegian adventurer Thor Heyerdahl's Kon-Tiki expedition in 1947 and the subsequent Academy Awards winning documentary that he produced. And then by the American author Rachel Carson's book, The Sea Around Us, which was translated almost instantaneously to both Danish and Swedish and became hugely popular here. Many writers and essayists and philosophers even thought of and wrote of the ocean in dialogue with Carson's romantic vision of an encompassing ocean full of life. And Hans Pettersson, the oceanographer, was one of the strongest public admirers of Carson's work. Another important form of knowledge on the move in this period was exhibitions. Through exhibitions, the material related to the explorations of the deep sea became circulated in Scandinavia. As was the case in the books, the tropical and exoticist elements that frame the deep sea were important factors in the exhibitions. In the spring of 1949, an exhibition of the Albatross expedition was arranged by the Oceanographic Institute and Sjöfartsmuseet in Gothenburg, and the first Galatea exhibition in Copenhagen took place in '52, only 2 weeks after the expedition's return to the Furthermore, a film was produced of the Galatea expedition that was often screened on exhibitions. At one occasion on the Christmas fair in the small Danish town of Viborg in November 1954, the Galatea film was screened jointly with Thor Heyerdahl's Kon-Tiki movie, and on several occasions, Galatea and Anton gave talks at the film. Exhibitions also became a way of responding to developments in the scientific work of analyzing the specimens from the expedition, a work which continued long after the end of the expeditions themselves. One example of this is shown here. It's an image from an article on an exhibition on urmollusks at the Zoological Museum in Copenhagen in 1957. It's from the Danish newspaper Aftonbladet, and the reporter's descriptive text by the photograph reads, quote, "From the mollusk exhibition, which opened at the museum yesterday, 2 Copenhagen boys marvel at the sight of a creature well over 499 million years older than themselves. To the right, the man behind the sensational discovery of the urmollusk, Dr. Henning Lemke. This deep-sea animal, Neopelina galatea, was deemed a sensation because it was monoplacophora, which is a class of mollusks that had at that time been believed to be extinct for many hundred million years. And this animal had been trawled from a depth of about 3,600 meters above the coast of Costa Rica. Exhibitions also circulated and moved the deep sea materials outside of Scandinavia. The Galatea exhibition in Paris in February 1957 was described as a great accomplishment by the Danish cultural attaché in Paris, having on that. And in 1960, several exhibitions of the expedition was held in important institutions and museums in the United States. And lastly, another important way in which the representations of the deep seas unfolded and spread was, of course, through translations of the book. Pettersson's book was translated as Westward Ho with the Albatross in 1953 and gained positive reviews in the United States. For example, by Rachel Carson in a full-page review in the New York Herald Tribune's book review. Galatea's Sea Sailing in turn was translated to English in 1956. So like I noted previously, the conceptualizations of the deep sea negotiated between the deep ocean as a total space and the potential variance of particular regions within it. They also actualized discussions of planetary and climatic old times. In different forms or formats, the vertical otherness of the deep sea was mirrored or linked to the horizontal otherness of equatorial island nations. A new kind of mass exoticism, it seems, were at play. It also played, these representations also played on the neo-romantic vision of Carson and the pleasant and racialized Pacific world, open world of Heyerdahl. Now, historians Lorraine Daston and Catherine Parr, they showed quite clearly in their book Wonders and the Order of Nature that affects or phenomena like wonder and curiosity are always at least partially historically and contextually specific. they show that affects or phenomena like wonder and curiosity are always at least partly historically and contextually specific and changing rather than trans-historically and mythical. They are effects influenced by and shaped in different political and social and cultural contexts of knowledge production and circulation. And this historical specificity of curiosity or wonder is quite clear in the phases of transposition or movement of deep sea knowledge that played out in Scandinavia during the 1950s. So this messy process of ocean knowledge moving and changing happened within a particular Scandinavian context, that is clear. But it also showed how that context was intersected with a larger scale, one that would seem international or maybe even oceanic, but would be more accurately described as Western European and American. I don't think one should describe this as it wouldn't be enough to describe it as a circulation of knowledge, at least not unless one thinks that process in critical terms, because as James Cord and Fafifan and other historians have duly emphasized, circulation might not be an ideal analytical concept for grasping the symmetries and power dynamics involved in how knowledge moves. It would seem rather that the deep oceans, in both a material and conceptual sense, underwent during these years a series of transpositions. Materials and ideas circulated, they moved, but only by being adapted and changed into various forms. To end, I would like to say something short of what I'm still looking to make more sense of in relation to these processes, which is their implications, to be frank. How did this knowledge on the move shape how conceptions of the deep sea evolved in Scandinavia beyond the 1950s, and whose knowledge it was, and where that knowledge played out. Very often, throughout history, the political nature of the deep oceans have been actualized in rather technocratic and remote contexts. The deep seas have largely been fields for imperial, military, high-tech actors, and that is largely the case today as well. Indeed, the notion that deep sea mining companies are the only viable producers of knowledge of the deep sea was one of the core justifications for the recent decision in the Norwegian Parliament suiting it to open for prospective exploration of the seabed on Norway's continental shelf. So this then presents historians with the pressing challenge in grasping the historicity of knowledges and ideas of the deep sea. What is the deep sea nature for life that is portrayed now? Who is describing it, and what is its organizing principles, the ideas and ways of seeing that underscore it? How and where, in what institutions of the collective imagination, are these renderings produced and reproduced, and where are they perhaps being challenged? Analyzing such asymmetries and mechanisms of oceanic knowledge on the move or in circulation historically may perhaps help us understand more clearly those that are playing out in our contemporary societies. Thank you.
Thank you. It's time for questions.
So I have lots of questions, but one is about you stress that things are moved but are changed in movement, and yet when you were describing Rachel Carson, it was sort of as if she moved across the Atlantic and landed there, and everybody just liked her romanticism in the same way. So can you say more about what Scandinavians liked about, because she seems to me such an American Cold War figure that her slipperiness in shifting across the Atlantic like that is really quite striking.
No, I think that's a good question, and one that I think I'm writing of this in the Shafting dissertation. That's one of the things that I think I would have to explore more, how that affirmation of her look like and what caused it. In general, there was this fascination for her ability to sort of tie together a fascination for the natural world with a sense of marveling at the deep time, and the deep time of the ocean. And there was this, the humans are from the sea, Homo erectus. Helen Rostodowski has written about that figure was surely at play. And then the the poetics of the ocean has a long history in Swedish literature and intellectual media as well. So that also played into it, because she was so good at, synthesizing these, in my mind, synthesizing these oceanographic state of the art with her poetic vision. I think that appealed to many, at least in the intellectual media in Sweden and Denmark at the time.
Can I ask a follow-up to that question? Yeah, so that's fascinating. So there's chapters in the Sea Around Us where Carlsson talks about climate change connected to submarine waves, right? And she talks about, I think it's a Swedish oceanographer or something like this that she draws upon. Was there interest in Scandinavia in also the way in which it connects to conservation issues? Any thoughts?
Right. I haven't seen that so far, although Hans Pettersson, who was the leader of the Albatross expedition, he did write a lot about the oceans and topics concerning the ocean in the press ahead of the expedition as well. He was a voice in the public space, so to say, and he did write about the potential need to go to the ocean to get enough sustenance for the world population, but also the potential crisis that could arise from that. And I think actually, unless there is a second Swedish oceanographer, it is Hans Pettersson who Rachel Carlsson refers to, because they were in correspondence. Right. He was one of the many oceanographers that she corresponded with.
Yeah, it's just so strange. She's got this kind of theory of climate change, but then it depends on the submarine waves and so on.
Yeah, but I thank you for the question, because that reminds me that I should look more closely to that relation. Also because was a lot of the Albatross work had to do with the age of the planet and past climates and that kind of stuff. So would it be conceivable that there would be an awareness beginning to rise there? Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
We have a question on the Zoom, so just feel free to unmute yourself.
Hi, it's me. I was going to ask, how does this emergent ocean-mindedness in Scandinavia connect to the development of an offshore extractive industries in Scandinavia from the 1950s onwards, but especially from the 1960s onwards? Is there a connection between this sort of expeditions and then what happens? Is I'm thinking the North Sea, but also deep sea mining, maybe.
Right. That is the big question, and I haven't begun, unfortunately, to explore that. So the honest answer would be I don't really know. I would like to find out, and I think that's an important question. I could just add that an important background would be ISIS and fisheries politics for the way that oceanographic institutions in Sweden and Scandinavia developed, which in turn, of course, would influence the vision that the way that Pettersson would envision the deep sea. So there was at least that I could say something on that. But this question that you point towards, I think, is fascinating. Yeah.
Sam's question, because I wonder whether the information that the Albatross and the Galatea were collecting, you're talking about the deep sea life that they collected in particular, but of course they're also doing other measurements of the seabed, which are more directly applicable or taken up by the energy industry. That the information they need is not about the fish and the creepy, things, but it's about the structures on the seabed that may or may not be suitable for their purposes.
Yeah.
And so my question is are the fish greenwashing?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. I think there is a scholar called Amanda Hargod who has written on, I guess she's written also on the historiography on Rachel Carlsson, commenting that not enough has been done to explore. She doesn't use that term, but the degree to which her discourse of wonder actually is greenwashing. Or contributes to a greenwashing in the general sentiments that going about. Well, I mean, it's to what degree this was greenwashing. It could be the case, but it could also be the case that one could read these books and sort of have them, at least the Galatea, have them interpret them as something that sort of disturbs this image of the deep sea that is a homogeneous and like how do you say that in English? Sorry, something that is not very striated or isn't you know, very biologically diverse. So I guess it can go, yeah, I guess it can go both ways, but at least it could be greenwashing, but it could also disturb this vision of a homogeneous, uniform space ripe for extraction, perhaps.
Oh, yeah.
That's good. Any other question?
I'm just gonna ask a small question. Could you tell us about this photo?
What?
The photograph.
Oh, sorry.
I'm very curious to know what it's asking.
I don't.
No, it's not high at all. It is from actually not from the two books I mentioned, but the third book was written by the doctor on the Albatros expedition, Erich, who was a hobby naturalist and also published a book a little bit later to kind of feed off this energy. But his book is similar in the way to Peterson's, in the way that it's, or even more actually, accentuates these exoticist elements. And this is an image from, I'm sorry to say that I don't remember where it's from exactly, but from fishermen on one of the islands that they visited. And I liked it because it's a reminder of the, you know, the exoticisms that were mobilized, but it's also sort of a nice image of depth and verticality and horizontality in the same moment, sort of. So, yeah.
Any last question? Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's turn to Scott Erich from City University of New York Graduate Center for the History and Theory of Extractive Seascapes. And Scott, I hear was struggling with or got COVID, so is joining us virtually.
Yes, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, and can you see the screen in full screen?
It's good.
It's good.
Okay. Okay, great. Well, thank you for the introduction. Yes, I'm Scott Erich. I have COVID. So unfortunately, I had planned to be in Halifax, but I had to cancel my trip. But I'm currently a postdoctoral research associate in the history department at University of Virginia. And today, I want to introduce the concept of extractive seascapes and offer a history of how one sea, the Persian Gulf, became one. This concept is one, sorry, I'm just starting a timer, is one I take up in my current book project about the fishing, pearling, and offshore oil industries around the Arabian Peninsula. And this term, my own neologism, extends from the work of the historical geographer Carl Sauer and his now ubiquitous phrase, cultural landscape, where culture is the agent, the natural area is the medium, and the cultural landscape is the result. In an extractive seascape, extraction is the agent, the ocean is the medium, and the extractive seascape is the result. In the context of the Persian Gulf, the region that I work in, this is a corrective measure because it pushes back against a number of common tropes that also haunt other seas. And these tropes come in kind of roughly two categories. Either that the sea is a flat surface, kind of what Viktor was just talking about. The sea is a flat surface, which is something to be crossed, a medium of connection or diaspora, or a source of cosmopolitanism. Or that the sea is a void, an asocial space, devoid of people, and a chasm of separation between continents. My hope is that the concept of extractive seascapes gives texture to the idea that the sea is, of course, far more than a surface, and it's an eminently social space in large part because of the extractive industries. It's inhabited and even crowded and intimately known, named, traversed, and plundered in 3 dimensions. I hope that the concept of extractive seascapes can travel, and that it might be useful in other contexts as a shorthand way of describing spaces of the global ocean that have long or acute histories of extraction, or that have unrightfully been glossed as mere surfaces to be crossed. To represent the type of knowing and inhabiting the sea I'm talking about, I'll introduce a map, which I'll explain more about in just a moment. But for the time being, what I want you to note is that the Gulf is not just blue space here, but a space that is named, known, fathomed, and occupied. Land here is blank space, and the ocean is charted. And this isn't just a navigational map, but it's a record of and plan for extraction. So my current book project that I'm working on, called Taming the Sea, Southeastern Arabia's Extractive Seascape, is buoyed by recent and excellent work on extraction as a heuristic in environmental history, anthropology, and STS, as a capacious but critical way of thinking about how humans alter the natural world and the environmental effects and social arrangements of those alterations. I engage with the framework of extraction because my main interlocutors are fishermen, and fishing is, after all, an extractive industry, even if it isn't one that has received as much attention as, say, mining or drilling in the literature on extraction. Moreover, in this specific body of water in the Persian Gulf, oil, which is a commodity that scholars of extraction often study, has completely transformed this seascape, as we'll see in a moment. So this gesture of thinking fish alongside other extractives isn't unique to me. It comes from classical political economy and its critique. And interestingly, from the early modern debate around the mare liberum, or free sea, advanced by Hugo Grotius, and the mare clausum, or closed sea, advanced by John Selden and William Wellwood. John Selden, the English jurist in the latter camp who argued for an enclosed sea, had a surprisingly prescient view of the sea some 350 years ahead of its time. And his legal treatise called Mare Clausum, or the dominion or ownership of the sea, he was convinced that the sea could be depleted and compared fishing to other extractive industries. So he said, truly we often see that the sea itself, by reason of other men's fishing, becomes worse for him that owns it. Yea, the plenty of such seas is lessened every hour, no otherwise than mines of metal or quarries of stone, or gardens when their treasures and fruits are taken away. So he was concerned about the North Sea herring fishery and the constant conflict between Dutch and English fishers in the North Sea. This is kind of a hidden transcript of that Mare Liberum, Mare Clausum debate. It's about empire, of course, but it's also about fish. But I just want to sit with this for a moment because this struck me as I was doing research. This idea that the sea, like a mine or a quarry or a plundered garden, is something that can be lessened every hour, which of course we now know to be true. For the remainder of my time, and by using a handful of images and maps, I want to tell a story about how people have rendered the sea knowable, extractable, and exhaustible, and how they have encountered the sea and its bounty, and how they've altered it. In the course of doing so, I'll chart some of the ways that knowledge circulates at a number of scales and along sometimes surprising networks, between, for example, 17th century Europe and the 20th century Persian Gulf, or between pearl divers and oil engineers. This map of the Persian Gulf I showed earlier will serve as our baseline. It was commissioned in the 1930s by a son of a former ruler of Dubai and shows the famed pearl banks of the Gulf in pretty exquisite detail. Their locations, their depths, their approximate size, the depths on the routes between them, and most interesting to me, their names. So if you look at this map, I don't know how well you can see it in the room, but the black splotches you see are islands. They're navigational hazards. And everything else, all the little circles you can see, are pearl beds, oyster reefs. And they're all written next to them. I don't know how well you can see again. Written next to them are names in Arabic. So some names indicate what might be found there. Names like al-Anbar, which means mother of ambergris, or Shaif, which means mother of sponges. Others seem to note abundance. Mandus, which means wedding chest, and Abu al-Bukhush, which means father of goodness. And other names we can only guess. Al-Bunduk, for example, means the gun. Is it referencing a past dispute, or is it referencing a sunken cannon on the seafloor? We don't know. The point is that even if the sea appears featureless on the surface to someone traveling across the Persian Gulf, its depths were intimately known and named for centuries. Pearls from the Persian Gulf were especially world-renowned. If you imagine a portrait of European royalty adorned with strings of pearls, they were likely fished from the Persian Gulf, especially from the Portuguese period from the 16th century onward. Importantly, these banks were fished as a commons, a mare liberum, for most of their history. Divers and their captains would come from the surrounding coasts and would fish any of the banks as they please, sometimes defaulting to the closest ones, other times traveling hundreds of kilometers. So for example, these pearl beds down closer to the coast of Abu Dhabi in the corner here, I don't know if you can see my cursor, dive boats would come all the way from Kuwait at the head of the Gulf to come all the way down to fish these banks. So it's interesting that these were a commons because John Selden, the early modern English jurist, to substantiate his claim about the sea being lessened every hour and its exhaustibility, in the very next breath, he was clearly inspired by the idea that the Mahometans, his words not mine, also thought that the sea was exhaustible and collected taxes on pearl diving and coral harvesting, saying that the Mahometans, or the Muslims in the Persian Gulf, estimate their seas no less on this account being that the sea can be lessened every hour. So already here we have an interesting kind of circulation of knowledge, of a half-remembered tradition from a place Selden never visited, being used as fodder for the Mare Clausum debate, which, as we'll see in a moment, comes back up again in the 20th century Persian Gulf. But back to the pearl banks. The Persian Gulf was under the jurisdiction of British Empire from the early 19th century onward, and interestingly, transformed during this period from a commons into a type of blend between Mare Liberum and Mare Clausum. The British Empire made it into a kind of racial commons, saying that anyone from the surrounding coasts, who they called Arabs, including on the Persian side, could fish for pearls, but no one else. British imperialists, moreover, went to great lengths to enforce this exclusionary commons, excluding Indian, Ottoman, German, and Japanese fishers, all of whom wanted to fish the lucrative banks. And the British did so, they excluded them on the basis that anything beyond the 3-mile limit, the so-called cannon shot rule, ownership was unenforceable because it was the high seas. So no concessions could be granted to foreign pearl divers in seas that were beyond 3 miles. In their enforcement of this policy, the institutional memory of empire seemed to recall both centuries-long conflicts with Dutch fishers in the North Sea and more recent conflicts with Canadian and American fishers on the Grand Banks, right where you are, off Halifax. With British officials writing in the early 20th century and late 19th century about troubling recent examples of the contentions on coasts inhabited by so-called civilized people, expressing worries about what conflicts over the fishery might occur in the Persian Gulf, which is a place they considered to be piratical by nature. The cannon shot rule, which the British used to justify the negation of concessions issued by local rulers, was also itself a product of the Mare Liberum, Mare Clausum debate, a reading of Grotius, tempered by Cornelius de Binkershoek, who argued that anything beyond the reach of a cannon, about 3 miles at his time of writing, was to be considered the high seas. This, of course, would all change with the discovery of oil. One of the first instances of finding oil at sea in this region, incidentally, came from pearl fishermen. In the fall of 1902, at the end of the pearl season, a Bahraini dhow was headed from the banks of the lower Gulf back to its home port when it noticed something peculiar offshore the small, uninhabited island of Halul. In a roughly circular shape several meters around, an iridescent and shiny puddle had formed, distinguished from the surrounding water not only by its dark color, but by its texture. It bubbled and undulated, but didn't peak like the ripples of salt water around it. As the hull of their dhow sliced through the puddle, and the liquid they could now see was brown and could now smell was oil, clung to the hull of the ship at the waterline, they saw it was apparently springing up from the ocean floor. Word got round to British officials, who were giddy at the idea of liquid bitumen, as they called it, in what they thought was terra nullius. As far as I'm aware, one official wrote, no one lays claim to Halul. Anyone occupying the island may assert ownership to the bitumen or petroleum found in its vicinity. British officials moved swiftly to both determine if anyone claimed to Halul and other marine areas, and set out to explore for oil at sea, where they were convinced oil could be reliably found. The question of what parts of the sea belonged to whom proved to be difficult. Local rulers, pearl divers, fishermen, captains, and others all had differing ideas about what belonged to whom. That general idea is the thrust of my book project. The British, who had argued for a half century that the sea could not be owned or leased or concessions granted on, that it was a kind of commons to be used only by local fishermen, started to reverse policy and began to suggest that local rulers might in fact be able to issue concessions over the marine environment. In 1952, a British judge codified this reversal in a ruling that's remarkable even today as a legal meditation on sedentary fisheries, the temperament of so-called Oriental rulers, the Sheikh of Abu Dhabi's knowledge of Grotius and de Binkershoek, and the problem with taking the idea that Britannia rules the waves literally. By the mid-20th century, concessions had been granted to companies like BP, which would herald a seascape transformation over the next 75 years. you can see here I've overlain a map of the concession areas on top of the Persian Gulf and the corresponding area around the pearl banks. The most promising site for oil was at Sheikh, the mother of sponges, a pearl reef just southeast of Halul. On this map, I don't know if you can see there, it's the space marked US1, Sheikh 1. A few years after a visit by the one and only Jacques Cousteau, whose Calypso surveyed the Gulf for BP, which is something I'd love to talk more about in the Q&A, considering all the other presentations were about expeditions, this Cousteau expedition, I'm writing a short article about now, it's fascinating. But a few years after his visit, the first offshore rig in the lower Gulf, the Adma Enterprise, was towed in and installed on top of the pearl bank at Sheikh, crushing the pearl bed beneath its massive footings. BP even hired a pearl diver to dive beneath the waves, as he had done so many times for pearls. But instead of looking for pearls or for fossilized rocks like Cousteau's men, he checked the soundness of the steel beams rising from the sea. The oilmen of BP adopted the name of the pearl bed for the oil field, Sheikh. And we don't know how or why, and I'm still fighting with BP for certain documents, which their archives are much harder to access after 1945. But it's easy to imagine that this pearl diver maybe had a hand. If he was taken out on the BP vessel to the oil rig to check the soundness of the beams, you can imagine saying, like, here we are, this is the Adma Enterprise at station 307, this random site on a grid in the sea. And the pearl diver looking over the edge of the boat and saying, no, this is Sheikh, I know this place. As it turned out, other pearl banks explicitly would prove to be useful sites for oil drilling. Oil companies acted on their concessions to drill throughout the lower Gulf, and likewise appropriated other names given to the pearl banks, given by long-dead divers to the new oil fields. The seascape of the Gulf, which has always been known and crowded by fishermen, became crowded in an entirely different way. This map with green patches is from our present, and shows the oil fields currently online in the lower Gulf run by Abu Dhabi National Oil Company, and their sub-concessionaires like BP, Exxon, Total, and China National Petroleum. The yellow circle I've circled here is Sheikh, and the red arrows are just for orientation for these two maps side by side. All of these oil fields, as you can see, carry the names of the pearl beds they sit atop. The sea surface and seabed, and the divers' memories and waters themselves, have all but been entirely subsumed by these companies. Materially, the whole of the lower Gulf today is choked with the machinery of oil extraction. When traveling on a fisherman's skiff, let's say if you leave Abu Dhabi or Dubai and head west, on a fisherman's skiff, you can always see rigs on the horizon, basically no matter where you are. And it's always kind of hazy and hot and dusty. So it's kind of an eerie feeling. And what adds to that is this kind of constant hum and thrum of helicopters overhead, which are constantly shuttling personnel from the coast to the offshore rigs and between offshore rigs. But interestingly, the story I'm telling isn't one of total elimination of fishing in favor of oil, at least not yet. Extractive seascapes are overdetermined places. There are so many causes and consequences, so much taken by so many people past and present. To paraphrase Alan Sekula, the levers are many and the results are unpredictable. Pearl diving became obsolete not because of oil rigs, but because of Mikimoto's cultured pearl in Japan, the invention of the cultured pearl as opposed to the wild pearl, and because there was more attractive contract work given by oil companies as opposed to the forms of debt slavery for pearl diving. Fishing for food, however, which pearl boats did in the off-season, would remain the region's most important local protein source, even so today, the most important and abundant natural local protein source. This map, layered on top of the map of the pearl beds and the concession map you can see under it, purports to show fishing activity in the region. At first glance, it seems that fishing has been boxed out by the oil concession areas and that the rigs have completely overtaken the seascape. This data of these green fishing activities is from the open source fisheries watchdog Global Fishing Watch, but it only reveals a partial truth. The data is from industrial fishing vessels with registered commercial GPS transponders. But importantly, that isn't the only type of fishing done in the region, especially for Oman and the UAE. The vast majority of fish in the lower Gulf, where Oman and the UAE are, where these concession areas are caught by small-scale artisanal fishermen who only sometimes carry GPS, and if they do, it isn't the kind registered in commercial ship networks. It's the kind that you or I could buy at REI, for example. And these fishermen happen to find that the waters beneath not only rigs, but beneath oil tankers, as you can see in the photo on the right, are surprisingly good places to catch fish. The cool waters under tankers, again, the picture on the right, allow shoaling fish to avoid predation by hiding in the shadows of these massive ships. So if you imagine you're in a school of fish and you're swimming around, a shark or any other predator like a tuna would be swimming below in the pelagic zone and looking up to see a school of fish between the sun and its shadow, the shadow that the school of fish casts. So when schools of fish find these tankers, they often stay in them instinctually to avoid predation. As far as the oil rigs go, those massive footings that I showed earlier that crush the pearl beds have given rise to prolific colonies of sedentary organisms like pearl oysters, barnacles, corals, and sponges that grow on these legs. These ecosystems, along with the cool shadows that those platforms that oil rigs have cast, also attract a whole host of small fish that in turn attract predatory fish that in turn attract fishermen. Oil company oceanographers have taken note how corals and oysters and sponges are actually much more abundant on rigs than they are in their own natural habitats, and they've become a focal point for larger organisms like gamefish. And fishermen, one report noted, have not been slow to take advantage of this. So this is a photo from taken by an oil worker of a fishing boat in the 1980s. And this is a practice that still happens that fishermen have relayed to me in my own ethnographic research. The concept of extractive seascapes encourage us to see the sea as palimpsest, as a layered history of plunder, ecology, the social relations of extraction, and even geology. This is how my interlocutors view the sea as well. The spatial coincidence of oil and fish in the Persian Gulf has given rise to a whole genre of critiques of local political economy, including the repeated refrain that kingfish or tuna are more valuable than oil by weight, or that the price of oil is setting fishermen on fire, or that oil is nothing more than fish petrified and taken from the sea. This last observation, apart from being geologically true, and that all of the oil in this region is fossilized planktonic life from the ocean of the Cretaceous period, gets at the heart of what I'm trying to convey with the concept of extractive seascapes. Commodities come and go, whether because they are exhausted materially or because the forces of empire or capital move on to something shinier. In the Persian Gulf, this possession has been one of pearls, fish, and oil. Across the global ocean, there's talk of valuable genetic material for pharmaceuticals, or mining the seabed for metallic nodules. In this region specifically, more and more of the seawater itself is extracted every day for desalination at the highest rate in the world, which alters the salinity of the sea. When seawater itself is rendered into property and lessened every hour, and the oil from those fields offshore is pumped and combusted in record numbers every day, and fish catches rise every year, with plans to rise more, the levers of this extractive seascape are not only being pulled, but broken. And the results, to quote Andreas Malm, might cost us the earth. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions for Scott? Sorry you couldn't be here. We got somebody else to share your session earlier. It worked out well.
Thank you.
Fantastic paper. Political theorists working on this issue are going to confront the notion of sovereignty of the ocean, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And the notion that Locke says the ocean is the common property of everyone because it's just extractive, and that the land can be worked on and improved and thereby belongs to those that do it. Now, there might be a difference between fishing and scraping the shit out of the bottom of the ocean in a fuzzy center on that, where people will claim, yes, it's now sovereign because we've actually worked it rather than dragnet or something. And you see the political theorists that are working around, I know that there's these issues about open water and who has sovereignty on it, but it certainly is a political theory issue as well, that can be quite astonishingly interesting when it comes to the debate over the difference between fishing and drilling.
Yes, thank you for your question. That is very important to me, this idea if the sea can be improved or not. And the whole second chapter, or third chapter of my book rather, looks at that idea from Locke, and it also looks at other classical political economy like Adam Smith, because Adam Smith talked about seaweed on the seashore. And he was saying that also cannot be improved, which we now know from seaweed farmers that it can. But in my work in the Persian Gulf, what I look at is two technologies that predate the oil age by a long shot, which is nearshore proprietary fishing reefs, where fishermen take boulders and sticks and branches in their skiff and take them offshore and throw them into the water to create what we now call fish aggregating devices. But they treat these as proprietary, and in their local code of the sea, or Sanat al-Bahr, which is what they call it, they say, okay, this encloses a space in a ½ kilometer in every direction from my proprietary reef. And then another technology that I look at, which sort of gets at the next step, which is that oil industry, is a type of fish trap that, we might call a weir in English, but they call hadra and miskar in Arabic. But it's a coastal fish trap that extends out to sea. And the rulers of Abu Dhabi and other emirates collected rents on these in the British imperial period. So people who built these traps paid rent to the rulers of Abu Dhabi and Dubai in order to harvest fish from them in the ocean. Of course, on the coastal ocean, but nevertheless, this is kind of an argument I'm trying to get at, is like, where does the classical political economy, the issue of sovereignty, and the issue of property as a global idea that entrench, Locke then, after the British imperial period, disperses throughout the world in uneven ways. How does that get taken up locally? So, I'm not confident in saying I can draw a direct line between the issue of offshore sovereignty between, for example, massacre, these traps, and pearl diving and oil. But that's what I'm trying to point at, is like, look, this isn't just the Harry Truman 1945 proclamation over the so-called continental shelf about these offshore oil fields, that there's a deeper history to how people claim and negotiate property at sea. But I'm so glad you brought up Locke, because while I don't love him as a person, it's something that I engage with a lot.
I asked a follow-up question to Gordon. Your presentation, fascinating presentation, and it made me think about UNCLOS and how you would see some of the stuff that the United Nations Commission of Law of the Sea from 1982 in light of this concept of extractive seascapes. And I'm thinking particularly in the relation to piracy, right? So UNCLOS talks about piracy. Piracy is robbery on the sea surface. You could be talking about a kind of robbery of undersea resources, often undertaken by empires, which piracy, and of course Grotius has taken up in that whole debate about piracy. And of course, there's a connection between overfishing and people turning to piracy as well. So I'm just wondering about some of your thoughts about piracy in relation to your discussion.
Yes, that's a great question. I love piracy. I wish I knew more about pirates and theory of piracy.
The person who asked that question is the world expert. That's great.
Okay, well, we need to be in touch. I'll send you an email after, and I'm so sorry I can't be there again. But the way I engage with piracy in my work is, so during the British period, before it was the United Arab Emirates, it was called the Trucial States because of a truce that the so-called pirates signed with the British. Because before that, it was called the Pirate Coast, the United Arab Emirates. Now, my working theory, and there's no documentation of this, but is that the so-called plunder and privation at sea that was happening in the Persian Gulf was a differing notion of property among the local sailors and pearlers of the region, who, when British burst in through the back door, they said, okay, this is the Darul Islam, so to speak. This is Islamic land and Islamic sea, and foreign invaders to it are subject to raiding. And that's legal, that's lawful. Because, I think the interesting question about piracy is, who's pirate? One man's pirate. But as far as the United Nations law on the sea go, the only way that I engage with it in my work is as in this long history, being that further substantiating claim of both hardening custom into law, and UNCLOS being the largest single enclosure of the sea on the planet. the largest single enclosure of any surface on the planet, not just the sea. So in the region that I work in now with the fisheries, there's not as much so-called piracy or like even slavery in the fishing industry like there is in, for example, Somalia or the South China Sea. But that's, you know, probably why I don't engage with it as much. But I'd love to talk with you about pirates more.
Yeah, no, because there's obviously there's a previously a romanticization of piracy as being somehow anti-imperial, and there's a lot of good scholarship showing that no, in fact, you know, empires have employed piracy for their own ends, and it strikes me that there's something here that's also a really interesting entry into that debate too. So,
right, thank
really
you.
important implication to look.
Good, Sam, on the.
Sam. Please go ahead.
Hello. Sorry, got a small one with me. I just wanted to push you on your concept of extractive seascapes. Because I can understand using the term extractive seascapes if what we're talking about is a change in maritime landscape. And you do a good job of showing that the maritime landscape has always been in. My puns are not going to be as good as yours. Boyd, what a great pun.
Boyd, yeah.
But let's say the visual seascape of the maritime world is always fluid. There we go. But why would you want to use extractive seascapes instead of the term extractive imaginaries that's been adopted by legal scholars who work on this exact area? Because it seems to me that, and you brought up Malm, which triggered me. If we're going to talk truly about Marxist interpretations of this, or we're going to talk about capital, or we're going to talk about you know, BP specifically, then really the BP doesn't give a monkey about seascapes, right? They don't care. What they care about is the extractive imaginary, which generates capital investment. And then creates an industrialized seascape that you're talking about. So, and I also think that you should think a little bit more creatively about UNCLOS, because UNCLOS is the ultimate history conference, right? As described by Sarabi Ranganathan, whose work, if you've not do a bit. So my kind of question is, what exactly is the limits of the term extractive seascape? And how does your work talk across other disciplines? Because I think personally, as a historian who's also written in this area, historians don't take as much notice of what I write in this area as legal scholars who are and politicians and diplomats who are currently working in the space. So
yeah, I mean, it's a good question, and I love being pushed on things like this. I guess, you know, I'm really trying to, in terms of what is the limit, I don't know. And I think we could ask the same thing about what is the limit of Carl Sauer's cultural landscape. I'm not trying to say, oh, well, this has the same purchase, but I think we can ask, what isn't a cultural landscape? You know, is there any part of land that is not altered by humans and has a symbiotic relationship with humans? In the same way, we could say, is there any part of the sea that is not an extractive seascape? You know, does this dilute the concept? I'm not sure yet, but what I can kind of maybe gesture at is like other places where this process is acute. And I would say like the North Sea, the Gulf of Mexico, you know, the Grand Banks. These are places that are continually contested as over extraction. And I think what the concept can do for us in terms of heuristic is think about with, for example, you know, there's great historians who've done fantastic work on the cod fishery and the Atlantic slave trade. And I think there's obviously, you know, tomes of great work on the Black Atlantic, but I think submerging that a little more is an interesting exercise. You know, the Black Atlantic is not just a surface to be crossed, that, as some scholars have rightfully pointed out, the dried cod fishery supported plantation slavery in the Caribbean. So as far as its limit, you know, I think the thrust of, you know, I have to say, I am sympathetic to Malm and Marxist arguments. And I think part of that is my response to you saying that BP doesn't care about seascapes, they care about imaginaries. I would say no one at BP knows what the word imaginary means. You know, I think even if they don't employ the word seascape, they look at the material reality of the sea and as a place to be mapped and known and plundered. Now, we could say as scholars, that's an imaginary. That's a way that they're conceptualizing and viewing the sea. But, it's something that part of why, and, Sam, I'd love to continue this conversation with you because maybe I can have you read this section because, I don't want to just create a neologism just to create it. I want it to be useful and have legs. And I think, this is part of why I asked about James Blair's book at the end of your last talk is like, he takes up this framework of extraction too. He's also an anthropologist like me, and he's from CUNY like I am. So, I would guess that we think alike. But, I don't want to just speak to other anthropologists. I want to speak to legal history. I want to speak to history and historians. And I don't want to just, create a word for the sake of doing it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I come from this very much as the point of view of a landlubber who sometimes goes into mines or underground. But I really wanted to ask you about this. It follows on from Sam's question quite well, I think, in the sense that when I think of seascape, I think of landscape, and you're modifying that with an adjective. So one way to think about it would be, what are the other seascapes that are out there that are not extractive? And then beyond that, how do those relate to the visual technologies that you showed create the notion of a seascape? Because one of the things that people who work on land have shown, and I'm thinking of Graham Burnett's book, for example, is that within the processes of mapping, landscapes, the kind of view, plays a very particular role in terms of establishing the viewer in relationship to the place. That sort of view is in some sense the place, I suppose, in the sea I'm located much more is in tourism, or places where you get underwater photography or films, which show the seascape in a way that is easier to assimilate to the human views of the land. And that particular sort of view is actually quite a different one in terms of the affect it creates. That relates back to the previous table, I think, creates much more of that sense of wonder and difference. So once you go below that flat view, just of the sea as a surface, then thinking about what is the role of effectively photography or other set of technologies within this that aren't necessarily just about extraction, and how do those relate back to the extractive landscape? Do you see what I'm getting at?
Yes, yeah, I do. And I will try my best to answer. It's a tough question. In terms of non-extractive seascapes, I think the short answer I can give is something like the Black Atlantic, or something like, if you're familiar with the literature on Indian Ocean studies, the Indian Ocean. That historians of the Indian Ocean are like, oh, this is a cosmopolitan place. Now, the saying something is an extractive seascape points out that there are other boats there too. That there's not just the boat carrying slaves or imperial officials or other people as a surface. So, I think this is, old hat, basically, to people like Daniela and Sam and Katie and Viktor and other folks who work on the ocean. It's old hat to say, like, the ocean has many dimensions. Now, that gets to your second question in terms of how do the visual technologies or other technologies of mapping play a role? What's interesting to me about the Persian Gulf is that before British Empire, the knowledge was privileged to pearl divers, who were some of the lowliest people in the population. The knowledge of what the seabed felt or looked like. Then with British Empire came the technology of sounding, plumbing, all of these technologies that they did all over the world. Now, I think the fact that you bring a photography, I'm going to just bring this back, really speaks to this, what I draw out that I didn't get time to draw out here, but Cousteau's role in creating an extractive seascape here, in terms of he literally for the Silent World, which I should have on my shelf here, but it's not there. But for the documentary that became The Silent World and the book that became The Silent World, he traveled through the Indian Ocean, which much of that material comes from, to do this contract for BP. And he took these images with his aqualung scuba divers and brought them to the Sheikh of Abu Dhabi in a way that rendered the sea that was the privileged knowledge of the lowliest divers knowable and extractable to a whole different set of people. And then, so that's what I think is the interesting case in this specific context. And then I think more broadly, that type of contouring and mapping that some of the other presenters on this panel have talked about is something that is like, indispensable in terms of knowing and defining what is for example, a continental shelf, that becomes the enabling thing to define an extractive seascape in terms of what can be appropriated. I don't know if that answered it, but it was an attempt.
Thanks. Unless anyone that hasn't spoken has a question, Sam.
I just wanted to come back on the Cousteau stuff because I don't think it's surprising that Cousteau is involved in oil exploration, because he's developing technologies that the oil industry is starting to adopt themselves, and at the same time he's leaning on their technologies, and his divers worked for oil, and it shouldn't be any surprise as much as it should, it shouldn't be any surprise, although it is that Arthur C. Clarke is a major booster for ocean industry and deep sea stuff, and John Steinbeck as well. Who's a writer, right? I think you might want to have a look at, there's a couple of journals created by and edited by Arthur C. Clarke, and the other one by John by Steinbeck. In the US, it's called Oceanology International and has a cool 60s bubble font. In Britain, it was called Hydrospace, term that they were using. And there's a lot, and you can see in that journal the cross between people like Cousteau trying to open up diving and create documentaries, and industry, and the it's very difficult to separate the two off. That kind of notion of an ecological, that we would have today, where you go, well, I'm working for Greenpeace, that it does not emerge until the 1970s.
Right. No, and that's I appreciate that observation too, because I think, I was reading I'm trying to write this short essay, not article, about Cousteau's visit there. And I was reading some of these other things with like the American Enterprise Institute on oil. And it's clear that he has this very interesting trajectory into like walking backwards into conservationism. That, I only knew him from being a child, and because I'm an Arabist and studied the Middle East. And so, this sort of, I think it's interesting that I also see Daniela in the chat saying that he was in Antarctica too, doing his own work down there, so that, he was in with oil and empire in certain ways that were not obvious to me. But, it's interesting to see that that's kind of his modus operandi. But I'll definitely look into these journals, Oceanography International, Oceanology International. Thank you, Sam.
I think I'm taking the subject of the discussion a little bit backwards, because I'm tired and just catching up with the previous question. I think I want to go back to the idea of the viewpoint that's involved in the idea of landscape and seascape, which has a really interesting history in oceanography tradition, right? That there's this very famous remark about the sea being inaccessible to man's vision and has to be accessed indirectly, and our understanding of this environment is always technologically mediated. And we never get that clear view that we aspire to in as a form of knowledge. And so I'm wondering whether the use of the word seascape then needs to acknowledge this history of describing the ocean's inaccessibility and the desirability of that access as a through a view of the sea. And it strikes me it's so important in your work, because you're in other work I've seen of you write so beautifully about sensing the environment in other ways. When you mentioned the acoustics or the haziness of your view a little bit, and you do that with your work on photography elsewhere. So I'm What do you think about this tradition of visualizing oceans as a sort of an aspiration of the ideal of science?
Yeah. No, I think that's also a great, thinking with this parallel between landscape and seascape. I wonder, well, first of all, I thank you for your question. I'd like you to clue me in on some of that specific literature on another time. But, I wonder if we could ask the same thing of geologists in mines, to go back to the question from my landlubber friend over there. But do geologists talk about before mountaintop removal, before, mining with dynamite to basically, completely scrape the top, was the underground also obscured, was also only partially viewed and very imperfectly in certain ways through the narrow cramped tunnel of a mine?
There's a lot of experts about the visual traditions in geology in the room here too, so. But I think the answer is yes. I mean, well, we'll have to just talk about this more.
Yeah, well, and I think it gets at that. I think we can, I'm trying to take the seascape and submerge it. I think we can do the same thing with this is where I think the extraction as a paradigm is useful, because that's my immediate reaction, is to wonder what the miners thought, because it's a not too dissimilar thing. And I think in terms of inaccessible and never a clear view, I think there's, as we know, other ways of seeing, that you can't see the fish when you're trying to fish them, but you see the birds, you see the ripples on the surface, you see all these other things that are very clear signs of something, even if you can't see it with your two eyes in the moment. But thank you for your question, Katie.
We might have one quick question.
I can just say, on the point, this is a very small point, but there's a very famous in Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology, where he talks about the different kinds of observers who would be really good at geology. And he specifically mentions that the ideal geologist would be an underground gnome, which is sort of a replacement for a miner.
An amphibian.
What?
He says an amphibian.
Yeah, well, he talks about going into different environments through different visual techniques that might make it possible to see what was really going on in these places. So that's one place to look. And there's an article by Mike Shortland called Darkness Visible, which some of it gets into psychiatry and psychology in a way that I'm not really up with. But that article does talk about the view of miners inside caves. That's in History of Science from about quite a long time ago, 20 years ago.
Okay. I'd love to take a look at that. I'd love to take a look at that, and I love Lyle, so thank you.
Okay, and thanks to Scott and to all the speakers in this double panel. And so at 4:15 there's a break, and then 4:30 plenary session at Alumni Hall, and people will do so. Thank you.
Thank you.